we're going to look at general theories for what makes a mental state conscious. So what most fundamentally, at a psychological or maybe neuroscientific level or even philosophical level, distinguishes the conscious from the unconscious. Now, when we talk about conscious or unconscious, the first thing to realize is when we use those terms in everyday discussion, you can isolate several different meanings of the word conscious. And like good academics, it will be useful to make sure we get the different meanings straight, at least recognize there's sort of different sorts of applications of the word conscious here, so we have some idea what we're talking about. So when we have a theory of conscious versus unconscious, we can say which of these meanings did we have in mind, because there might be different sorts of theories we need for different sorts of meanings. So what I'm going to do here, there's various ways of sort of separating meanings. I'm going to follow the New York philosopher David Rosenthal, who, because I think what he's done is looked at the uses of the terms we might have most naturally in everyday conversation, so we can directly relate to these different uses. And that's me and David in Taiwan on the edge of an approaching typhoon in Taroko Gorge. So the first meaning of conscious, you might say something like Bill is conscious, or the boxer was not unconscious, or is he conscious yet? That you could call, what David Rosenthal calls creature consciousness, in the sense you apply the word conscious to the whole creature, to Bill. Bill as a whole, is he conscious? And what we mean by that is something like awake, alert, versus asleep, unresponsive, and so on. So all of the word is sounds a bit binary. Bill is conscious or unconscious. You know, in boxing and martial arts, you have technical knockouts. You can be concussed. You can be half asleep, and so on. So it's probably useful to think of this as graded to some degree. But there are also clearly cases where you say, like all of you now, are conscious, alert and awake, and other cases where you're fast asleep and out of it, and you say you're unconscious. But maybe there are gradations in between, and we're going to have a little look at that in just a few slides' time. The saying Bill is conscious is one thing, but instead of simply saying Bill is conscious, we might say of Bill whether he is conscious of something. Was he conscious of the noise? You see, Bill could be conscious in the sense of awake, but he wasn't conscious of the noise. So that sense of conscious means you were, in some sense, responsive to or aware of some particular stimulus. In fact, regardless of your status of creature consciousness. So you could be asleep, that is, creature unconscious, and hear the alarm clock going off, maybe in your dreams. The alarm clock really did go off, and it could either be incorporated into your dream as a sound in your dream, or you might remain asleep but be aware, there's my alarm clock going off, I need to get up. So you can be creature unconscious and conscious of the alarm clock. Or you could be creature conscious and not conscious of the alarm clock. So you see, these are different meanings, therefore. But the creature consciousness business is about the general state of the organism in some sense. Its alertness and so on. And conscious of a particular stimulus means something about you being responsive, representing that stimulus out there. And finally, I should say transitive, that's a sort of grammatical word here. Verbs are transitive if they take an object. like I kicked the cat. Kick takes an object, the cat, so that's a transitive verb. But you can't say I slept the cat. Slept doesn't take an object. You just sleep, that's it. You say I sleep. It's intransitive. So in this sense of consciousness, it takes an object. There's something you're conscious of. So transitive consciousness. But there's another meaning of the word conscious versus unconscious you could use, and that's in talking about mental states. So you don't apply the term to the creature as a whole, but you apply it to one of the creature's mental states. So Freud talked about desires being unconscious. And in fact, what we're going to do in this module is ask questions about whether perception, can some perception be conscious or unconscious? Can some memory be conscious or unconscious? We're going to ask about mental states, whether they can be conscious or unconscious. And again, this is a somewhat different meaning of the word, because again, you could be creature unconscious, sleep, but still have conscious mental states. You could be consciously experiencing something, you still have unconscious experiences. You might desire something in your dream and know that you desire it and consciously desire it. So you have a conscious desire. So you have a conscious desire in your dream, even though you're creature unconscious, sleeping. Does that make sense to people? Are there any questions? So sometimes I think when people come up with theories of consciousness, sometimes they're trying to explain creature consciousness, and sometimes they're trying to explain mental state consciousness, and I think they're quite different things, and we may or may not need different theories for those different uses of the term consciousness, but we at least want to keep in mind that we might need different theories and make sure we know what we're applying the ideas to, and therefore what the evidence is really about. So let me consider some interesting dissociations, if you like, between those meanings of the word conscious. So let's take being relatively creature unconscious with mental state consciousness. There's a clinical condition called vegetative state. That term is still used, although a better term, I think, a more recent one, is unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. If you get hit on the head very badly, maybe you had a car accident, you go into a coma. So that's at the bottom level of sort of creature consciousness. In a coma, not much of your brain is functioning. You're just lying there very still, maybe for years and years and years, and you may not wake up. It's like constant dreamless sleep. Although what mental life goes on is, of course, a interesting question. Now, some people from coma then go up to the next level, which is this, say, vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. They do have a wake-sleep cycle. So the person may sit up and sort of be moving, but in a way that's unresponsive to the environment. Call the name, they don't respond. They don't seem to respond to any stimuli. It's like there's some sort of state of wakefulness, if you like, but the person's not all there. They don't know what's going on. It's just the body, just sort of some motor alertness going on. So this would be like in terms of creature consciousness, I talk about a gradation. This is, well, it's sort of awake, but on the other hand, it doesn't feel like the person's fully creature conscious. You wouldn't want to say they're fully creature conscious in the way that you and I are. The next level up is a minimally conscious state, where you have some evidence that they do have conscious mental states. And there is some small responsiveness to the environment. And if they get to that level, there's a good chance that they could then wake up and come out of it. So one question is, I mean, this is obviously very hard to clinically diagnose, so if you're going to distinguish between vegetative state and minimally conscious state, what you want to know is, are there conscious mental states going on, in virtue of which the person is aware of something that's happening in the environment. Because if there is, that's a minimal conscious state, and the prognosis is a whole lot better than if it's just vegetative state. So it's clinically important, and certainly if it was your loved one who was in this state, it might be important to you to know, were they having conscious mental states or not. Owen, who's originally did this work in Cambridge, now in Canada, did this interesting experiment with using language, so this won't work on everyone, because a lot of people who go into coma vegetative state, they've damaged the language system. That's not working. But some people, it seems, the language system is working, as we will see. Now, if you ask normal controls, say undergraduates, to imagine different things, so say, imagine playing tennis, or imagine walking about your house, walking through different rooms of your house. Then those two imaginative activities will preferentially activate different parts of the brain. So the tennis versus house, you'll get more activity in the supplementary motor area, because you're imagining the motor actions. Right? There's a greater emphasis in your mind on motor actions, so you get more motor activity, supplementary motor area activity. But when you're thinking about going about your house, there's greater emphasis on spatial navigation, and so you get spatial areas more active than in the tennis case. And in fact, with controls, you can tell from the brain scans which of these activities is the person thinking of, because of the differential activity between those different areas. So then the question is, let's say we asked patients who are putatively in vegetative state to imagine these things, what would happen? And in just a few cases, you do get the right pattern of activity, indicating that they were following the instructions. Now, regardless of what theory of consciousness you have, it seems intuitive that if you can follow instructions to sustain a particular sort of imagination of you doing a certain sort of activity on request, that's a conscious mental state. And as long as you're willing to accept that, then this patient, who had previously been classified as vegetative state, does actually have a fairly rich conscious mental life. He or she could follow instructions and engage in sustained imagination. So this person should be reclassified not as vegetative state. Now, in fact, if a person fails this test, it doesn't mean there's no conscious mental states going on, because maybe they don't understand language because of temporary permanent brain damage. Maybe there's damage to attentional areas, they simply can't sustain attention, and so on. Or maybe they were just out of it at the time you asked the question. But at least if they do satisfy the test, you have excellent evidence of conscious mental states going on in a person who's very low in creature consciousness. The thought then came to these researchers is we could use this to ask some interesting questions. For example, you could say, if your answer to the question is yes, think about tennis. If the answer to the question is no, think about walking about the house. Are you in pain? And ask a series of questions that could be of clinical relevance and indeed help that person have a more comfortable life. Now to consider another distinction that's somewhat a bit less obvious, but is going to be fundamental to the ideas that we talk about. And that's the distinction between transitive consciousness and mental state consciousness. So remember, transitive consciousness is being conscious of some stimulus, and mental state consciousness is the question of whether a mental state was conscious or not. So now, could you have transitive consciousness and mental state unconsciousness? Could you be transitively conscious of something with an unconscious mental state? Because that would show that these two meanings of the term really are different, you see. They're not just different ways of saying the same thing. Now, if you have damage to V1, that's the first cortical area which visual information projects to, it can seem to the person that they're blind in a certain part of the visual field. So I don't see anything there. And naturally, one's first instinct is to take that at face value. They say they're blind. They don't see anything. And indeed, if they were thirsty and there was a glass of water in the blind field, they wouldn't pick it up and drink it. So this isn't all blind people, by the way. This is just when you're blind because of damage to V1. It turns out, though, that visual information processing is going on. So you can show them, say, you present on the computer screen in the blind part of their visual field, say motion going up or motion going down. And you say, was it up or down? Or you show a square or a circle, and you say, was it a square or a circle? And they can be amazingly accurate at this. They can be 80%, 90% accurate, while claiming they did not see anything at all. So the way it goes is you say, tell me, are the dots moving up or down? And the patient might say, well, don't be silly, I can't tell you that, I can't see a thing. So you say, well, just humour me, just guess. Just guess, is it up or down? And they say, well, it's kind of silly because I don't see anything, but I don't know, I'll guess up. And then they get it right with a very high degree of accuracy. So what's going on there? Well, you presented a square, and they're saying square versus circle with a high degree of accuracy. So there must be a sense in which they've seen the square, right? Because they're getting it right. So there must be sort of a square visual representation here. There must be, in some sense, knowledge of it being a square in the visual parts of the brain that does form recognition. So if you take aware of to be responsive to, then they're aware of the square in that sort of minimal sense. If you take seeing to mean because of light reaching the eyes and information getting to visual parts of the cortices, they can respond accurately, well then they're seeing the square. So in that, as long as we're clear, that's sort of a minimal sense we're talking about. It's not necessarily the fully fledged natural English language use of the term see or conscious. Because if I say to you, Bill sees the square or Bill sees the tree, you'd normally take me to mean he consciously sees the tree, right? The English language doesn't really distinguish between consciously seeing things and unconsciously seeing things. So we can easily be misled by that. But there is a sense in which he sees, and there is a sense which he's responsive to, and therefore a sense in which he is conscious of the square. So that's transitive consciousness. But now, is the mental state conscious? Well, this is a mental state, the state of seeing, that the person sincerely denies having. They sincerely believe and earnestly believe that they are blind in that area, they do not see anything. So the person doesn't consciously see. So what we have is an unconscious mental state, but still transitive consciousness of the stimulus. Does that make sense? So we can, in special cases, pull apart those two meanings of conscious. Feel free to interrupt any time if you want to ask questions, disagree with me. So what we've done so far is distinguished several meanings of the word conscious, and I hope giving you some examples to flesh out why those meanings really are different. So when we talk about consciousness, we need to be clear about which of those meanings we're talking about, so we know what our theories are trying to explain. Now I just want to carry on with a little bit more sort of philosophical or sort of analysis of use of terms. One way of thinking about mental states is to think of a mental state as having some content. That's what's it about, or what it says about the world. And the way you have that content. It's a little bit abstract, so I'll give you an example. So if I see that the ball is blue, then the content of the mental state, what it's sort of saying is the ball is blue. That's the content. How do I have that content? Well, in this seeing way of having content, I see that the ball is blue. You could have the same content with another way of having it. For example, I could want that the ball is blue. Now, in some ways that's the same content, the ball is blue, but it's held in a different way, in a wanting way rather than a seeing way. So what I want to say is that you can either change the content, or you can change the way it's held, and you've got a different mental state. So seeing the ball is blue and wanting the ball is blue are clearly different mental states. There's a sense in which a particular piece of content there is the same, but the mental states are different because one is seeing and the other is wanting. Also, seeing that the ball is blue would be different than seeing that the sky is blue. They're both seeing things, but the contents are different, so clearly they're different mental states. So I say this because it's going to be useful to keep clear in our mind when we're dealing with different mental states and why. And to do that, it will help us to think about what the content is and the way the content is held. So what I'd like you to do now is to discuss with the person next to you, say a mental state, any mental state you like, and then say what is the content and what is the way it's held, and try that for a few examples until you get an idea of this sort of fairly rough and ready distinction. Yeah. So if you don't know the person next to you, just introduce yourselves, and I'll give you a few minutes to try out some ideas. Okay, so I don't know what you're all talking about. I hope you felt you had some grip on what that distinction is. One way of using a mental state might be to describe enduring dispositions of a person. Like we had creativity. That's not the sort of mental state we're talking about here. If a person is creative, that you could think of as a disposition to have certain particular mental states that actually happen, like a disposition to think up, to have certain ideas. Then the having of the idea, the novel idea, that would be a mental state we could analyse in this way. Some mental states, what you might call a mental state, are quite complex things. Even something like an emotion. So, well, what's the content in emotion? It's not obvious, actually. And there's a big debate, and we'll come to that when we talk about emotions. How do we analyse emotions? And precisely what the content is depends a little bit on your theory. But one way of analysing emotions is to say that they involve making appraisals about the world. So if you're angry, that means you've judged that the world, something has been unjust and stopped you from doing something. So then that aspect of emotion would involve the mental state of thinking, it was unjust that Bill stopped me from doing something. Other theories of emotion emphasise perceptions of your bodily state, knowing that your heart is beating fast and other changes in your body. Well, then the content is the bodily changes that happen, and the way in which you hold it is the interoceptive sense we have, by which we can sense our internal state. So the question can be tricky, exactly what the content is and the way it's held. But hopefully you get the general idea. Were there any questions? Particularly difficult cases? Alright, so that's sort of cleared the groundwork and the basic ideas, and so now we're going to go on to consider what are really the two main theories, certainly within psychology, of how to characterize when a mental state is conscious versus unconscious. And I'd say these are the two dominant ones that guide research into neuroscience and psychology when it comes to consciousness. So I'll roughly think of theories as falling in one of these two camps, and for each of these camps there's lots of different, if you wanted to read up on them, you find lots of different variations and arguments about exactly how to characterize what's going on. But each of these camps has a sort of fundamental theme or defining idea, which is what I want to get across to you, so you understand the intuition behind each of these ideas. And we'll spend about 5 minutes before we have a break looking at higher order approaches. Then we'll break for coffee, and then afterwards we'll carry on with higher order approaches and consider integration approaches. So one way of thinking about the central claim of higher order approaches is something that at first sounds like a platitude or a truism. Conscious mental state is a mental state of which one is conscious. Now you might be surprised that some philosophers froth at the mouth when you say that and say that can't possibly be true. Probably at first glance it seems to you something that's maybe obviously true. Isn't it just playing with words? So what I want to convince you of is it's not actually playing with words when we sort of understand it properly, as it were. It is making an empirical claim, and indeed a claim you might end up disagreeing with. Or not, we'll see. But at least it will be an empirical claim we can put on the table, and you can choose to use it as a theory or accept it or reject it. One way of seeing this is actually saying something. It's not just playing with words. Is it's relating two senses of the word conscious: state consciousness, mental state consciousness, a conscious mental state. Involves you being transitively conscious of the state. Now we agreed these are different meanings of the word. So what this claim is doing is relating two separate meanings. So that means it is saying something. Let me give you the intuition behind it. If you felt that the Blindsight patient that we talked about didn't have conscious seeing, what was the basis for your thought that they did not have conscious seeing? It was probably that they sincerely denied that they saw. We know that they did see because they're getting it so right. They're using their eyes to create representations in the visual area to get things consistently right. There's a sense in which they're seeing. But they sincerely and earnestly denied that they saw. So they weren't aware of the seeing. It was because they weren't aware of the seeing that maybe you feel motivated to say they didn't consciously see. They saw, but they didn't consciously see. They didn't have transitive consciousness of the seeing. So to turn this into a theory, we're going to make another claim that to be conscious of something, you need to have a mental state about it. So if you're conscious of a dog being there, you need to have a mental state that says something like, there's a dog. So only if you have a mental state, you can be conscious of something. Therefore, to be conscious of seeing, you need to have a mental state about seeing. You need to have a mental state about a mental state. So conscious mental states, like conscious seeing, involve mental states about mental states. And that's the fundamental psychological claim of this theory. That's why it's saying something. It's not obvious that conscious experiences, to conscious mental states, you need mental states about mental states. But that's the conclusion we come to if we accept a conscious mental state as a mental state of which we are conscious. So a mental state about a mental state you call the second order mental state. If you form in your visual area something with the content the tree is green, that's just about the world. So we'll call that a first order mental state. Mental states which are just about the world, they're first order. And according to the theory, they cannot be conscious in themselves. If all you had was first order mental states, you'd never have any conscious mental states, according to this theory. Yes, because the Blindsight patient says square. And when the Blindsight patient says square, he's saying something about the world. So that's first order. So all the Blindsight patient needs is representations about the world, and they can get the job done. They can say square, circle, and so on, and be accurate. But what they seem to miss is a representation that they are seeing. So they don't have a mental state with the content. I see that the tree is green. And this is where the distinction is crucial for your understanding between content and how that content is held. So when I put in little single quotes here something, I'm specifying the content of the mental state. So what the Blindsight patient is missing is something like, I see that it's a square there. A representation with that content. If I have the content square there, but I don't have the content in a mental state, I see that the square is there. So let me just go through this with some pictures. First order mental state is a mental state about the world, and that makes us transitively conscious of the world. Conscious of the world. So I've put single quotes here, so that's the content, the tree is green. So that's a first order mental state because it's about the world. Here, this content, I see the tree is green. That's about that first order mental state. It's a mental state about the mental state. So that's the second order mental state, or the higher order thought, if you like. Because the higher order state makes you aware of having the first order state. You're conscious of you having the first order state, and therefore it's a conscious mental state. Okay, let's carry on. So what does this first order mental state make you conscious of? You can tell the person next to you, this first order state, what does it make you conscious of? The tree is green. It makes you conscious of this thing in the world here, this tree being green. What does the second order mental state make you conscious of? The first order mental state, right. So the first order state makes you conscious of the world. The second order state makes you conscious of having the first order state. So this first order state is conscious, is mental state consciousness, because of the second order state making you conscious of it. Is the second order state conscious? In the picture here, would the second order state be conscious? Well, if you just think about what the theory is saying, the second order state itself is not conscious unless you're conscious of it. So remember, the second order state is only conscious if you're conscious of it. So what would you need to be conscious of the second order state? A third order state, right. That's right. So the third order state would have the content, basically, that you have a second order state. That's what this content is. And that just sort of logically follows from the theory. So now let's relate this to different experiences you might have or not have. If you just had the first order state, you would be conscious of the world, right? But you'd be like the Blindsight patient. You're not conscious of that seeing, but you're conscious of the world, but you're not conscious of the mental state. So if all you had was a first order state and nothing else, you would have an unconscious mental state, according to this theory. Does that make sense? That's the Blindsight case. Now when you have a second order mental state, that makes you conscious of the first order state. You might say it makes you consciously aware of the world. You consciously see the world. You're consciously aware of the world. You don't just see the world, you consciously see the world. So another way of putting it is consciously aware of the world. You're conscious of the first order state. And that's when you have a conscious mental state, you consciously see. Now I just want you to reflect on when you came into this lecture theatre, and you either you came in this door or you came in that door, right? Now when you came in, did you consciously see the door? Probably, I'm guessing. You might not have done, you might have been completely autopilot. But maybe you were searching for this room, this is our first lecture. Probably you consciously saw the door. You weren't sort of going around completely automatic pilot. But now when you sort of look at the door now, and you consciously see the door, and I want you to be conscious of that conscious seeing. You see? Are you aware that you consciously see the door? Now we could call that introspection, or introspective awareness. You're conscious of your conscious mental state. Now that's a slightly different way of seeing that door, as it were, than when you first walked in. When you first walked in, you consciously saw the door, but not in an introspective way. Does that make sense? So then what's the difference between consciously seeing and introspectively seeing? Well, when you consciously see, you have a conscious mental state. We just need a second order mental state for that. But when you walked in, you had that second order mental state. Were you aware of the second order mental state? Probably not. You probably just had it. But when you introspect, you become aware of the second order state. You become aware of consciously seeing. So on this David Rosenthal way of seeing things, consciously aware of a mental state, or introspectively aware, being introspective, involves a third order mental state. So these three different ways of seeing, if you like, correspond to the three different orders: first order, second order, third order. And that's not a uncontroversial way of seeing things. Some people might say, now hang on a minute, surely introspection is second order. That'll be a more natural way of saying it, probably. Introspection is second order. But on this way of thinking about things, it becomes third order, because if you just had a second order thought, you wouldn't be aware of the second order thought, so it wouldn't be introspection. So what I would like you to do, because in some sense this is just sort of logically spelling out the idea that we started with back on this slide here. Conscious mental state is a mental state of which one is conscious. You just rigorously stick to that. And this idea that to be conscious of something you need a mental state, you just follow that through logically. You come to these conclusions. So on the one hand, we're just spelling out what follows from our assumptions. On the other hand, I think it's a little bit tricky and not necessarily a natural way of seeing things. And it doesn't even have to be a way that in the end you agree with. But I just like you to understand this way of spelling it out. So could you give another example, like I used the door? Think of something else and think about the unconscious case, the conscious case, and the introspective case, and relate that to higher order thought theory with the person next to you to make sure you have a grasp of this. Okay, so I just have a question for you. I see the tree is green. Is that first order or second order? It depends what content is. When I say that, am I describing the mental state or giving you the content? So if I said, I see, put the content here, the tree is green, then that would be first order, because the content is first order, and the seeing here is just telling me what the mental state is.
So what's the second and third?
Alright, so then second, if I said all of that was the content, I see the tree is green, now that's second order. That's why it's desperately important to distinguish content from the whole mental state and understanding this. I think this is why a lot of people get confused about higher order thought theory. They don't clearly mark out what is the content of the mental state. So what matters is the content. When the content is just about the world, the tree is green, that's first order. When the content is about first order state, then that's second. So a second order state could be I think I see the tree is green, but I think business isn't part of the content, that's describing the state itself, right? So that's why that's second order. But as soon as I take that and put it in the content, I think I see the tree is green. Now that's third order. So just be very careful about knowing what the content is in your mind. Are there any questions on that? I tell you what, why don't you re-describe what I just said to the person next to you, because that's really important for understanding. Okay, so I just want to mention one implication of this approach. People like, I think you quote Steve Fleming, have done work on metacognition and which parts of the brain are involved in metacognition. Metacognition being cognition about cognition, mental states about mental states. So we can say, depending on the exact metacognitive task involved, it involves anterior prefrontal areas. So what higher order thought theory is saying is if those areas are necessary for establishing that you are in a certain mental state, then that's part of the brain that's crucially involved with having conscious mental states. And we'll be looking at this sort of neuroscientific component of the theory as we go through the module. I just want to consider two counter-arguments you might have to higher order thought theory. One thing you might say, and people have said, is being metacognitive is pretty complex, really. I mean, babies, for example, maybe they don't have concepts of mental states, nor do animals. You might know the famous Sally Ann task, introduced by Wimmer and Perner, where you find that children of about 3 don't really understand beliefs very well, and particularly the notion of false belief. They find it hard to grasp that someone else could have a false belief when the child themselves knows actually what's going on. And there's meant to be a major understanding in a child's understanding of the mind and mental concepts around about age 3 or 4, where some people, as I say, acquire a theory of mind. So now what you might say is if they didn't understand mental states before then, they couldn't have thoughts about having mental states. So are you saying that 2-year-olds don't have conscious mental states? And if you're saying that, surely higher order thought theory is wrong. But that's not quite accurate in terms of what the psychological literature shows. What it shows is that there's a major developmental milestone at the age 3 or 4 in the understanding of mental states. It doesn't show that they didn't understand mental states before then. In fact, 2-year-olds demonstrably do have some understanding of mental states. In fact, there's evidence that pushes back understanding of mental states quite young, to infancy, to maybe 7 months old or even younger. It's just that understanding develops. And indeed, as we grow older as adults, we have richer understanding of mental states, just because we talk about mental states a lot, and why did so-and-so do so-and-so, and relationships and so on. We're constantly enriching our understanding of mental states all through our lives. But we still had understandings of mental states. So we don't know how far back we can push that, but there's no definite age in which we can say a baby or child doesn't understand mental states. But I guess you'd have to say, if you're going to be a higher order theorist, that if we did somehow establish that a fetus or a newborn had no mental state concepts whatsoever, you would be forced to bite the bullet and say, therefore, they don't have conscious mental states. But there's no definite position in which we're forced to say that. You might say, well, what about animals? Surely my dog has conscious experiences. Well, it's difficult to know what mental state concepts animals have, but there's increasing evidence that there's a range of animals that do have mental state concepts, including dogs, apes, I think corvids, sort of clever bird, but maybe not rats, and not all mammals. At least on this particular task I'm going to talk about. What you do in the data I'm showing is for a dolphin. It makes a discrimination between tones and has to indicate whether a tone is higher or lower than a reference tone. So now this is the pitch of the tone, and this is how accurate the animal is in making the discrimination. And if the reference tone is here, you see it's very difficult to make the discrimination. Obviously, as the target tone and the reference tone become closer together, your accuracy is going to go down. There comes a point where you simply can't make it, or the discrimination becomes difficult to make. Okay, that's just how things have to be. But now, the first tweak was to say we're going to give the animals another button called the opt-out button. And what they can choose to do, having seen the stimulus, is press the opt-out button, and then that's the end of trial. They don't have to make the discrimination. So now, one interpretation of the opt-out button is it could be an uncertainty monitoring response. You opt out when you're uncertain. And indeed, the use of the opt-out button here peaks at the point where the task is most difficult. So there's one interpretation is the animals know the task is difficult. That is, it's a metacognitive judgment about their ability to make a discrimination. Which is just another way of saying it's a judgment about their uncertainty. Well, if they can judge their uncertainty, they're making a judgment about the mental states. And so they do seem to mental state concepts. Now, the evidence I present here isn't quite good enough to make the claim, because, for example, the animal might be using the opt-out button to mean something like in this frequency range. You see, it might be a judgment about the world, about the frequency range here. But this team have come up with good evidence. For example, you can train the animal to opt out on one task, and then they will immediately use the opt-out button on a completely new and different task. For example, you could train them to use it on a perceptual task, but they can then use it to choose to opt out of a difficult memory judgment. So I find that rather more compelling. The opt-out button can't have meant something about this range of frequencies if the animal immediately generalizes it to, say, a memory judgment, something completely different. So, I leave you to read up that literature, but it's fascinating to think, we may be able to get some handle on whether animals do have mental state concepts, even though they don't have language and can't tell us. And in any case, this at least leaves open that animals do have mental state concepts. We certainly can't rule it out. Personally, in my own ethical judgments, I don't eat warm-blooded animals, on the safe side. I don't know any cold-blooded animals that there's evidence for higher-order thoughts. Now, another criticism you might make of higher-order thought theory is to say, well, I don't seem to be having all these higher-order thoughts all the time. Like when you walked in the room and consciously saw the door there, you weren't aware of having higher-order thoughts. You just consciously saw the door there. But remember, in a way, we've already dealt with that objection, because you wouldn't be, according to the theory, you wouldn't be conscious of your second-order thoughts unless you're having third-order thoughts. And so it just means we don't go around having third-order thoughts all the time. They're reasonably rare things. That's when we deliberately introspect. So of course we're not aware of these higher-order thoughts all the time. So I'll leave higher-order thought theory there. It's not an established theory in the sense that there's consensus about it. So it's one of the theories that have attracted a following, people feel the intuition for, and use to guide their research. But as we'll come to, there are other ways of thinking about consciousness. Now, very broadly, you could say if it's not higher order, it's sort of first order. So if you're going to have a first order theory, a non-higher order theory, you'd want to say there's something about certain first order states that makes them conscious. There's some quality of first order state maybe is very strong or established or rich. We're going to come to that. There's something about it that allows some first order states to be conscious and not others. But I just will say at this point, just as a general point about all first order states, if you do go this route and reject higher order thought theory for whatever reason, you're going to have to accept that you can end up claiming that because some first order state was very strong, stable, whatever, was conscious, that a person could be in a conscious mental state while sincerely denying that they're in that state, that are examples. So if you can give up on higher order thought theory, you might have to face someone who says, look, I do not see whether it's going up or down. Really, I do not see. And you say, no, you're consciously seeing. Your first order state has the right qualities, so it's conscious seeing. So that's the sort of the bullet you have to bite if you go the non-higher order thought theory route. Just as I said, a bullet you might have to bite if you go the higher order thought route is to accept maybe some animals or babies and so on don't have conscious mental experiences, if in the fullness of time we showed they didn't have any mental state concepts. So it's always the way in academia. If you accept something and run with it, you're going to have to accept some consequences you might not intuitively want to, but you're sort of pushed into certain corners by accepting certain positions. So this brings us to integration theories. And the idea here has been put in various ways. One sort of older philosophical way of putting it is conscious information is informationally promiscuous. Meaning conscious information can be used all over the brain or the mind in all sorts of different ways. Or as Daniel Dennett put it, consciousness is fame in the brain. So if some information is famous in the brain, in that all different bits of the brain can use it and know about it, then it's conscious. So I'm just going to dwell a little bit on a particular way of spelling this out by Giulio Tononi and Edelman. Edelman was a Nobel Prize winner in how the immune system worked. He showed how you could acquire immunity, got the Nobel Prize for that, and then he turned his attention to consciousness for a good part of his scientific career. Now, if you think about any sort of conscious experience, say of this painting here, your conscious experience has two main characteristics I want to draw out. One is when you look at a picture, indeed this room or anything at all, you're making lots of different discriminations at once. It's very rich in that sense. So that would be different from, say, a little photodiode that goes on if it's red and off if it's not red. And that was the only discrimination that it made. It seems our mind never makes one discrimination. It's making a ton of discrimination. So one way of putting this is every conscious scene is differentiated. On the other hand, it's not like there's a lot of independent discriminations going on. There's a sense in which your conscious experience is sort of unified into one whole. Everything happens in relation to everything else. So we say it's integrated. Every conscious scene is integrated. Contrast would be a camera where you've got just lots of pixels. And whatever each pixel does can be quite independent to what any other pixel does. Just each pixel independently makes its own discrimination, and that's all it does. Whereas for us, it's not like a bunch of different discriminations. It's everything happening in one unified field. It's all coherent in some way, integrated. There's Giulio Tononi, who's a psychiatrist who's particularly been spelling out these ideas. Now that's true even if you're in a completely black room. So it would seem like you like the photodiode, just saying black, but actually you're not just saying black. You're thinking about all the other things that it could be. You're actually making a very fine discrimination between lots of different alternatives. It's not just a black, non-black discrimination. Your mind is richer than that, even when you're in a completely black room. So what we need to get conscious experience is both high differentiation and high integration. Now I sort of want to illustrate, if you had too much of one, why it's not conscious. Let's say in your brain what happened was each neuron was on or off independently of every other neuron. Just randomly on or off with no sort of connection between them. No neuron guiding another neuron. They'll be very differentiated. Each neuron could tell you something completely different from every other neuron because they're not really connected together. So they're giving different information. So it's highly differentiated, but not at all integrated. So if your neurons were just going on and off randomly, high differentiation but no integration, so that wouldn't be conscious experience. You say, all right, well, what would be the opposite of that? Would that be better? But what about if all my neurons are on and all are off at the same time? That's very integrated then. All the neurons are strongly linked together. But would that be a conscious experience? Could that brain be conscious? Well, that's what happens in seizure when a person's unconscious. That's not what happens when you're having conscious experiences. And that's to have high degree of integration but no differentiation. So you see, the opposites don't work. If you have too much differentiation, no integration, that can't give you conscious experience. You don't have the unified field. Or if you have complete integration, you don't end up having any differentiation. That's just making a single discrimination on, off, on, off. Also no conscious experience. So work is being done on how do you get the balance. Is there some mathematical way of characterizing maximizing both integration and differentiation at once? And there's various ways of doing that. Tononi's come up with a certain way of doing it. Anil Seth, who runs the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Research here, has his own preferred way of doing it. And they look at things like if you take people sleeping or not sleeping and try and measure this informational complexity, that maximizing both differentiation and integration, can you find measures that are high when people have a high degree of creature consciousness and are low when people are, say, asleep, in dreamless sleep? And then once you had such a measure, could you use it to measure whether, I don't know, a robot has conscious experience or an octopus, and radically different types of systems like this. Here's a study that illustrates these points. So if there was a high degree of information and integration in the brain, then the idea is if you stimulated the brain at a certain point, that information that you've introduced would travel through the brain, and you would find the consequences of that travelling through the brain, being sustained, and perhaps travelling for long distances because of the integration of the brain, different brain parts. And in fact, Massimini applied TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a fluctuating magnetic field, to premotor area, either when a person was awake or when they're asleep. And you just look through EEG, what are the consequences of that disturbance of the brain? And what they find is that during wakefulness, you can monitor that disturbance for a long time, 280 milliseconds here, and you can see that it travels to distant parts of the brain. Whereas in non-REM sleep, the disturbance rapidly dies out and doesn't travel very far. As if the bit of the brain you disturb is localized or isolated from the rest of the brain, not integrated. So the information can't travel. So that's one sort of approach to integration theories, is to look at mathematical measures of complexity that would maximize jointly and simultaneously integration and differentiation. Another idea that comes from cognitive psychology, which is in some sense the same intuition that consciousness has something to do with integrating information on a wide scale, is the global workspace theory, which was developed in 1988 by Bernard Baars and picked up especially by Stanislas Dehaene in Paris, who's been doing very productive work with it since. The idea here is we can think of the mind as a set of specialist processes. Maybe there's a bit of the brain that does colour discrimination, a bit of the brain that controls motor actions and so on. But each of these little specialist processes just has information for itself. There's the language part of the brain that does some grammar, but what it's doing, it just keeps to itself. But what it can do, as it were, is to post its outputs into a global workspace. Once information is in the global workspace, any of the processes can access it. That information is globally available. And it's that global availability that makes it conscious in this theory. That's really just another way of saying when information can be integrated widely with different things, different bits of the brain are doing, it's conscious, it's fame in the brain, it's inferentially promiscuous. So conscious information is information you could use for any purpose, by any bit of the brain that finds that relevant. Whereas unconscious information is just isolated to a particular processor. So your brains right now are processing complex grammatical information. There's a bit of your brain that's fully aware of the most nuanced grammatical category of every word that I say. But is that available to you for general use? So I might say to lift up your right hand every time I use an adverb. Now, you can do that if you have conscious knowledge about adverbs. But you could take someone who is never trained in grammar, who doesn't understand these things, and they do know adverbs because they use that bit of the grammar processing to know when I'm using an adverb or not, to understand what I'm saying. But it's just specific to that little processor. They couldn't use it to lift an arm every time I used an adverb. They can only use it to understand language. So that's the idea here. Information that's specific and isolated to a particular processor is unconscious. Information that's broadcasted, who's in a global workspace, is conscious. So those are the two main ideas: higher order theories, integration theories, and we'll be looking at them throughout the module. So that's now your overview of them, and this is what we'll do. This is now the our syllabus, as it were. We're going to look at memory next lecture and see in what sense could you have conscious or unconscious memory? And from a higher order perspective, the question is, could you use memory and not be aware that you have a memory? in unconscious memory. Perception, two lectures after that. Could you perceive and not be aware of perceiving? Knowledge, we'll look at learning, implicit learning. And we'll look at volition. Can you intend to do things and not be aware of your intentions? And we'll get on to hypnosis when we get to that part of the course.